Seed oils are of the devil. They are the cause of every problem in the world. Wow.
With the introduction of seed oils from 1910, we see a steady rise in chronic illness, gradually increasing rates of obesity, gradually increasing rates of cancer, gradually increasing rates of heart disease, gradually increasing rates of diabetes.
You may be wrong. Uh-oh.
It appears to basically have no effect on cancer. It's not negative. It's not going the other way. It's not showing that polyunsaturated fats are way worse for you than saturated fat. It's either neutral or positive. You know, Paul Saladino started this, linoleic acid. Oh.
All of this is nutribabble nonsense. This seed oil conspiracy is the weirdest thing ever. This is a highly refined food.
Obviously, it is more than compensated by the positive effects that it has.
There's a war being waged right now in the dietary spheres over seed oils. One side said seed oils are good, and the other side said seed oils are the cause of most modern diseases. Now, there's a few people who are parked on the fence on this situation. So where do I stand on this topic? Well, I have personally eliminated seed oils from my diet for the past 10 years. And in this video, I'm going to show you what has happened to my health. So what even are seed oils? Seed oils are the oils from the seeds of plants that are extracted, usually using chemicals like hexane. These oils are then refined, bleached, heated and deodorized, aka they are ultra processed, and then the oils eventually go to be stored in plastic containers rich in plasticizers, and then they are cooked over and over and over again. Common examples of these oils include soybean oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, corn oil, safflower oil, and cottonseed oil. These are some of the main oils that have been incorporated into the diet. And these oils are ubiquitous in the foods we eat every day now. Packaged foods, processed foods, the restaurants that we eat at cook with these oils. People have them in their homes. They become very commonplace. Now, until recent history, with the advent of polyester and the subsequent decrease in production of cotton, seed oils were not a large part of the human diet. Seed oil consumption has increased massively over the past 100 years, and chronic diseases have also increased massively in parallel. These diseases like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, and cancer. Now, randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis are not clear on the long-term effects of seed oils. Are they beneficial? Are they harmful? It's a mixed bag. But we do have mechanisms by which seed oils may be directly involved with these diseases. And I'm going to lay out some of those mechanisms in this video. In this video, I'm going to share my journey that led me to avoiding seed oils. I'm going to break down how seed oils may be damaging your health. I'm going to show you the fat sources that I personally eat every day to avoid seed oils. I'm going to show you a full breakdown of my low seed oil diet and how you can use the principles that I use to build out my diet to lower the seed oil intake in your diet. And then last but not least, I'm going to show you what my personal lipid panel looks like after 10 years of no seed oils in my diet. So stay tuned to the end of this video so that you can see this lipid panel and this full breakdown. Let's start with a brief rundown of my story with seed oils. And I think you'll actually be able to relate here, especially if you've been in the dietary spheres for any period of time. So I started with the standard American diet. I grew up in the US, outside New York City, New Jersey. So I was eating a pretty standard American diet. I had a starch, a meat, a vegetable, and then a bunch of different processed foods in between. My parents did make sure we ate a good 3 meals, but what happened in between, well, that was a different story. Of course, I had health issues, and for me, it was digestive issues. Around the time that I was in middle school, I started to take things into my own hands, and I started to read about health. Now, I started trying the different healthy diets that I saw in these newsletters. A lot of them pushed me towards plant-based, a more vegetarian way of eating, and I did feel marginally better, but over time, as I got more down into this rabbit hole of plant-based, vegetarian, vegan, lowering my meat intake, things like this, I started to feel much, much worse. Now, at this point, I decided that I needed to get some help. I have started to see many doctors, general practitioners, gastroenterologists, holistic doctors, integrative doctors, chiropractors, and they all told me I had the healthiest diet. They said that I just needed to maybe take some supplements and make some adjustments here and there. And so that's what I did. I started getting on the supplement bandwagon. Now, I didn't really get better. If anything, I eventually started getting much worse. I wasn't able to eat because I was having extreme GI pain. So what I wound up doing while I was in high school is I wound up fasting all day long, doing 1 meal a day, OMAD. And eventually I lost way too much weight. So I'm about 6'2". At this point in time, I was like 145, 150 pounds. Eventually, after a bunch of GI doctor visits, nothing's wrong with me. I have a healthy diet. They referred me to the surgeon. And then the surgeon said, oh yeah, it's your gallbladder. We'll take it out. So they took out my gallbladder unnecessarily. At this point, my digestion was significantly worse. It was worse than it was before, although I just wasn't having as much as abdominal pain. And at this point, I found low carb and paleo. Once I did paleo low carb, I felt infinitely better. Eventually went into paleo, keto, intermittent fasting, and all the way to carnivore. And then I started to get hormonal problems, stress issues, digestive issues, workout performance is bad. I've made other videos about this. You can check those out on my channel. And then that eventually led me to Dr. Ray Peat's work. One of the central focus was the avoidance of seed oils, the avoidance of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, which seed oils are rich in. So what I did is I started to add carbs back in my diet. And around 2015, I started obsessively avoiding seed oils in my diet. We're almost in 2025, so we're about that 10-year time frame. What convinced me to avoid seed oils? I want to briefly talk about mechanisms, and then we could start to talk about what fat sources I use instead. And I'll also show you what my breakdown is inside my diet. Now, first things first, I mentioned this in the beginning, seed oils are ultra processed most times. They're extracted with chemical solvents like hexane. They are then bleached. Then they are heated and deodorized. Then they are stored in plastic containers for months on end. Then they are heated again, often multiple times, often at high temperatures for cooking purposes. So what are the specific mechanisms beyond the ultra processing? So seed oils are high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, why is this a problem? The omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are easily oxidized because they have double bonds in their structure. Their structure makes them very susceptible to oxidation. Now, once they become oxidized, once they're damaged, these damaged products are not so great for the body. And in fact, you can find oxidized omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids directly in the plaques in your arteries if you have cardiovascular disease. So you find them in high amounts. Now, the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats are also the precursors to the major inflammatory mediators in the body called the eicosanoids. And these inflammatory mediators are found in multiple chronic disease states like diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and also autoimmunity, things like cancer, etc. Another thing is many of these seed oils have other metabolic byproducts besides the eicosanoids that are problematic. Things like malonyl dialdehyde, you have thiobarbituric reactive oxygen species, oxylipins, the HODs, the HEDs, oxidized LDL, and a variety of these different products that get created from the oxidation of these fats, again, because their structure is very unstable and very liable to be damaged. These are also found in these chronic disease states, basically the less long you live. Once I quit seed oils, what fats did I use? Well, this actually took me a while to figure out. And the reason why is I don't have a gallbladder. And now this creates a big problem for me. Why? Because there's only three types of fats. There's monounsaturated fats, there's polyunsaturated fats, and there's saturated fats. I'm not doing the polyunsaturated fats, not in any high amounts. I have to be very careful with my saturated fatty acids. So what's left is monounsaturated fatty acids. So what I wound up having to do is I wound up having to mess with my monounsaturated fatty acid intake and my saturated fatty acid intake to find the ratio that works best for me. You're also going to have to find the ratio that works best for you. Now, what fat sources did I wind up using to hit my fat target? So let me show you. So the first fat source I have here are macadamia nuts, raw, organic, unroasted macadamia nuts. And my wife roasts them a little bit with some salt. So they come out like this and they taste really good. They have a kind of a popcorn flavor. The next thing I have is dark chocolate. So these are actually covered coffee beans. I'm here in Costa Rica. So I've been doing these dark chocolate covered coffee beans. They're greater than 70% dark chocolate. That's what I shoot for. Then I have a high quality extra virgin olive oil. This is actually a Coratina variety. This is the one that I tend to like the most because it's high in polyphenols, has a lower polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. And then the last thing I do here is I do grass-fed beef. So I'll use the fat from the beef, the high quality grass-fed beef. What I found is that if I have a mix of these different fats, you have the monounsaturated fats from the olive oil and the monounsaturated fats with the macadamia nuts. And then you have the saturated fats from the dark chocolate. And then the mix of the saturated and monounsaturated fats from the grass-fed beef. What I wind up doing is I have about a 50-50 mix, almost 50-50 mix of the monounsaturated and saturated fatty acids. And I found that this doesn't trigger the bile acid symptoms for me. These fat choices are the ones that I found to work best for me. You have to figure out which fat choices work best for you. So I will put some more options that you can include in your diet at the back end of this video, because different people will tolerate different fat sources better than other fat sources. I like to spend some time with my clients figuring out which fat sources that they tolerate the best. Now, if you're looking to get your diet dialed in so that you can protect yourself from the ravages of excess polyunsaturated fatty acids and seed oils, so that you can recover your metabolic health after years of seed oil intake, and you can lose the excess body fat where you store these seed oils over the years, possibly improve cardiovascular health, improve gut function, etc., you can check out my new coaching program that I'm going to be launching this month. The link is in the description. So now that I've shown you the fat sources that I use in my diet to minimize my seed oil intake, I want to actually show you what these fat sources look like structured in my diet. So I'm going to actually open Chronometer up here and show you a full breakdown of my diet, and then walk you through how I'm managing my fatty acid intake. This is an example day. This is actually what I was eating on September 2nd. What you'll first see here is I have about 4 meals per day, and I have an even amount of fat per meal. So I spread my fat out evenly across the day so that I can maintain satiety and my blood sugar regulation with each meal. So I have about 20 grams of fat per meal. I'm having about a total of 80 grams of fat per day. So I am shooting to have my fat intake between 20 to 30% of my total caloric intake. Now, it goes a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the day, but this is generally where I found that I feel and function the best. If I go too low on fat, I can find that I have issues with my libido or my satiety or my blood sugar regulation. If I go too high, I start to get digestive issues or feel excessively full. So this is the sweet spot for me. The sweet spot for you will vary. With my clients, I am working to figure out their specific sweet spot based on their goals. After I figure out my total fat intake, what I start to do then is I try to make sure that my polyunsaturated fatty acid intake, my total polyunsaturated fatty acid intake, omega-3 and omega-6, is less than 4 grams per 2,000 calories. And I have about 3,200 calories, so I have a target of less than 6 grams per day. I am at 5.7 grams, so I'm below that target. Now, can you be a bit higher, a bit lower? Sure. After that, once I have my total polyunsaturated fatty acid intake dialed in, the next thing I do is I look to balance my omega-3 and my omega-6 ratio. So I want a 3-to-1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s. Now, why do I want this? The omega-6s are inflammatory in general. The omega-3s are anti-inflammatory in general. If you have too high omega-6 intake, which is very common in the Western diet, then you are trending towards an inflammatory lipid profile. So I try to balance them. On this day, I'm a little bit less than 4-to-1. So I'm between 3-to-1 and 4-to-1 with 4.1 grams of omega-6 fats and 1.2 grams of omega-3 fats. Now, I do incorporate seafood in my diet on a regular basis, shrimp, scallops. I'll do different types of fish, mahi, tuna, things like this. So I'm having these on a regular basis, flounder, cod, sole, etc. And so just today I had mainly chicken. So that is how I'm managing my omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. On some days I'm way better because I have the seafood, and on other days it's not as great because I'm doing mainly chicken or beef or something along these lines. Now, once I have my omega-3 to my omega-6 ratio dialed in, the next thing I'm doing is I'm managing my vitamin E to my polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. So what I'm trying to do is get at least 0.4 milligrams of vitamin E for every 1 gram of polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. I supplement with just a little bit of vitamin E to make sure that that ratio is fully dialed in. So I have about 100 milligrams of vitamin E here per day, and I have about 6 grams of polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. So I'm way above that ratio. And again, I'm not trying to get a massive dose of vitamin E, just enough to protect my body from the lipid peroxidation from these polyunsaturated fatty acids that you generally find in seed oils, which I've also worked to minimize my diet. So I'm minimizing the total amount of these peroxidizable fats, and I'm making sure I have enough antioxidants on board so that my body is able to minimize any type of lipid peroxidation on a regular basis. So we were lowering the total amount, managing the ratio of the different types, and then protecting them with adequate amounts of vitamin E. And just so I can show you here, on this day, my major fat sources were dark chocolate, 78%, and then I have the macadamia nuts. There's a minor amount of fat coming in from some of these other foods, whey protein, chicken breast, pineapple juice apparently, but most of the fat is really coming in from the dark chocolate and the macadamia nuts that I have situated here. Now, the last thing I'll show you, and this is something that I had mentioned before, is that I'm constantly playing around with my monounsaturated to saturated fat intake to minimize what's going on with my digestive system because I don't have a gallbladder. And this is where those specific contextual components become really important to figure out on an individual basis. So I shift towards the sources that work best for me on a regular basis. Now, last but not least here, what I want to do is I want to show you my lab results after 10 years of a low polyunsaturated fatty acid diet. So we're going to look at my lipid profile. I'm going to go through these different markers from my most recent blood test. First things first here, this is my lipid profile. So we have my triglycerides. We have my VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. Then you have a full lipid panel. You have my total cholesterol, my HDL cholesterol, and then we have triglycerides, LDL cholesterol. And then down here, we'll talk about the different important ratios. And then we also have CRP and homocysteine, and I'll talk about the importance of those as well. So first things first, since triglycerides is here at the top, despite eating all the carbs that we saw, and despite my fat source being 50-50 saturated, or roughly 50-50 saturated monounsaturated, my triglycerides are about 50 milligrams per deciliter. So I like to see my triglyceride value less than 100 on a regular basis. So 50 is great. Again, this is just indicative of where my metabolic health is at. I am metabolically healthy. I am tolerating carbohydrates well. I am tolerating the fat source that I incorporate in my diet on a regular basis. Next things after triglycerides we have here is VLDL cholesterol. Now, not many people tend to focus on VLDL cholesterol, but it is a great marker to look at to help get an overall sense of your cardiovascular risk. And I actually like the VLDL cholesterol to be less than 24 milligrams per deciliter, even though the range is less than 30. So I'm actually at 10 milligrams per deciliter here. So basically, this is indicating a relatively low risk for cardiovascular disease, a better marker to look at than just LDL cholesterol alone. Next things, after this, my total cholesterol. It's actually a bit low on this one, about 123 milligrams per deciliter. Now, my total cholesterol always tends to run low. I think this is related to the bile stuff going on with my lack of a gallbladder. And also, even in my family, the lipid profiles tend to run low. So I tend to have a lower cholesterol value overall. I tend to like to have people less than that 200 mark, which we see here, not necessarily as low as I am here. And this is my lipid profiles have always run like this. The next thing we can see is my HDL cholesterol is definitely lower than ideal. So this is not ideal. I would like to see this a bit higher. I would like to see this closer or at least above 60 milligrams per deciliter. With my total cholesterol being so low, my HDL is also going to be on the lower side. And also, as we can see, my LDL cholesterol is also exceptionally low at 72 milligrams per deciliter, which again, I like to see this less than 100. Now, the next thing we could talk about are the ratios. One of the major ratios to look at when you're looking at a lipid panel is your total cholesterol to your HDL ratio. And ideally, the range here is less than 5. But ideally, we want this less than 3. That's associated with some of the lowest cardiovascular risk. Now, I'm not less than 3 here. I'm at 3.2. So I'm not too far off, but I would like to see my HDL come up over time and then bring my total cholesterol to HDL ratio down a bit further so that it is below 3. But overall, I have a pretty low cardiovascular risk with this ratio, with the 3-to-1 total cholesterol to HDL ratio. Now, another ratio that's not listed here that you can also look at is your LDL to HDL ratio. Now, my LDL is 72 and my HDL is 39. So my LDL to HDL ratio is 1.8 to 1. Ideal is less than 2.3. So my ratio there is excellent. Another one is the triglycerides, which are 50 to my HDL ratio, which is 39. And the ratio here for me is 1.3 to 1. Ideal is less than 1.9. So with this said, my total cholesterol to HDL ratio, my LDL to HDL ratio, and my triglyceride to HDL ratio are actually not too far from the ideal targets. 2 of them are actually ideal. One of them is right at that borderline. So my cardiovascular risk based on this basic lipid panel is actually pretty good overall. And the reason I'm sharing these ratios is because these ratios are better indicators of cardiovascular risk than just total cholesterol, just LDL cholesterol. And in fact, the total cholesterol to HDL ratio is actually pretty close in terms of the estimating cardiovascular risk to ApoB, which is one of these tests that have been discussed heavily in the dietary sphere recently. Now, the next thing we talk about here is my CRP value. So CRP is a marker of inflammation. And ideally, when we're looking at this, and it's very strongly associated with cardiovascular disease, but also infections and general inflammation, what we're seeing here is my overall inflammatory burden is quite low. And ideally, we want this less than 1. Average is kind of 1 to 3. Greater than 3 is low grade inflammation. Greater than 10, you're starting to assume that there's maybe some infection going on or acute inflammatory stimuli. But in general, I want to see it less than 1 on a regular basis. And what we see here is I'm less than 0.3. So my general inflammatory burden is quite low overall. The last one here is homocysteine. Now, homocysteine is a marker of methylation. It's a marker of your B12 status, your folate status, your betaine choline status, as well as the different genetic predisposition you can have with different mutations in MTHFR, MTR, different components like this. And so ideally, you want this homocysteine value to be less than 7. So for me, I'm making sure I have enough of the methylated B vitamins and enough of the cysteine and methionine and choline in my diet on a regular basis so that my methylation is under control, my homocysteine is low. And homocysteine is actually an amino acid that can cause oxidative stress at the vasculature. So it's another marker that you can look at when you're determining your cardiovascular risk. Key takeaways that you can start to understand and incorporate in your diet right now to minimize the negative impact of seed oils on your health. So first things first, seed oils are heavily processed fats. They're common from plants like soybeans, corn, cotton seeds, sunflower seeds, rape seeds, and safflower seeds. They are chemically extracted using solvents like hexane. They're often heavily refined, bleached, heated and deodorized, and then stored in plastic containers rich in plasticizers and heated over and over and over again during the cooking process. They are ubiquitous in the food supply. They are present in processed foods, and most restaurants are cooking with seed oils currently. Seed oils have multiple mechanisms by which they may be involved with chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, insulin resistance, autoimmunity, cancer, etc. This is largely due to them being high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids that are easily oxidized due to their structure. The omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are precursors to inflammatory signaling mediators in the body. These are the eicosanoids. They can produce toxic metabolites. We talked about some of those, the oxylipins, the HODs, malonyl-dialdehyde, the T-bars. When they are incorporated into the cellular structure, they can be associated with decreased lifespan. We see this with Dr. A.J. Halpert's work. Now, you can minimize the negative effect of the seed oils. And here's basically what I do to do that is I shoot to have less than 4 grams per 2,000 calories of polyunsaturated fatty acids per day, which automatically precludes me from incorporating seed oils in my diet because they're quite high in the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. I then shoot to have my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio to be 3 to 1. Then I try to make sure that my vitamin E intake is at least 0.4 milligrams of vitamin E for every 1 gram of polyunsaturated fatty acids in my diet. And then I fill in the rest of my diet with monounsaturated fatty acids and saturated fatty acids. And you have to figure out basically which ratio of the monounsaturated to saturated fatty acids is going to work best for you. So that's going to take a little bit of playing with on your end. This is something I'm doing with my clients on a regular basis. If there's not a very specific target, because there's a lot of individuality with these different components. Other thing I'll mention is that I do tend to like to shoot for my total fat intake to be about 20 to 30% of my calories. Now, some fat sources that you can incorporate to minimize polyunsaturated fatty acids and seed oils in your diet, you can use things like 70% or greater low heavy metal organic dark chocolate. You can use organic macadamia nuts and macadamia nut oil. You can use organic hazelnuts. You can use olives and olive oil. I like the Coratina variety because it tends to be lower in polyunsaturated fatty acids, and it tends to have a greater amount of the protective polyphenolic compounds like oleuropein and hydroxytyrosol. You can use avocados. You can use extra virgin palm oil and palm kernel oil if you tolerate them. The palm kernel oil is high in medium chain fats. Some people don't tolerate that digestively. You can also use organic extra virgin coconut oil. Again, the medium chain fats can bother some people's digestion. You can also use grass-fed beef fat and grass-fed fatty red meat. There's also egg yolks. And then if you tolerate dairy fats, of course, those can be a great fat to incorporate in your diet. Ideally, grass-fed dairy is what I would choose for. Now, with that said, that wraps up this video. I want to thank you for listening. I greatly appreciate the engagement support. Leave me comments below about what you think about this video. And there's more valuable and actionable content that I'll be producing on a regular basis to help you improve your health. So stay tuned.